All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is a very special event for us on all of our streaming channels. We are going through a panel discussion now on modern monitoring and observability. I'm Mandi Walls. I'm a DevOps advocate here at PagerDuty. And with me today, I have four amazing panelists who are absolutely amazing resources on this particular set of topics and lots of other things too. But this is what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves, and then we'll get into your questions that we got in advance. If you have any additional questions or comments for us, if you're watching live on Twitch or LinkedIn, I will see those there. If you're watching live on YouTube, I won't, unfortunately. So if you have a question, you might want to pop over to one of the other platforms. All right, so let's get rolling. Steve is the first one I see. So Steve, introduce yourself, who you are, what do you do?
Hi, Steve McGhee. I'm a longtime SRE at Google, and I morphed myself into a reliability advocate, which is a job title I just invented. Turns out there's other ones too, but I invented it independently, I think. And my history with monitoring is probably 20-ish, maybe 18 years long at this point. And my first thing that I'm proud of doing was I accidentally introduced a term into Wikipedia, which is kind of funny. So there was something called Google Test Ad for a while, which was I made a monitoring system that made sure that our ads were showing up on other sites. And we did so much of it that everyone who was watching the weblogs were like, why are people searching for products called Google Test Ad? We should definitely like sell more of those. We're like, no. It's not a real thing. So I accidentally overdid it for a little while there. But I made a Wikipedia page. It's pretty cool.
Excellent. Peco?
Hi, Peco Karayanev. I'm with PagerDuty on the product side for automation. But through my career, I've had like really two passions, which is analytics, observability, as we call it nowadays, and automation. So both doing the work in the trenches as SRE, actually with Ernest back in the day at National Instruments, and then the past dozen years or so have been on the product side, trying to build good utilities, good tooling for engineers. So good to be here.
Awesome. And your partner in crime there, Ernest.
Yes, howdy. I'm Ernest Mueller from Austin, Texas. I am an associate director out at Accenture. Our previous firm got acquired, so I am a new Accenture person. I've been in tech for 30 years and have been, kind of in DevOps and cloud majority for large companies and small. Worked with Peco at National Instruments back, 20 years ago starting, and I've worked for a variety of startups and large organizations, helping them get things together. So, and a brief stint as a product manager for a observability company called Copper Egg back. I'm losing track of how many years ago that was now.
Make me feel old, Ernest. I don't know. And Jason?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Good to be here. My name is Jason Hand, and I'm a senior developer advocate over at Datadog. I've actually been with Datadog now for just a little bit. Started over the summer in July. And prior to that, I spent a few years at Azure doing some stuff there. And spent also a little bit of time prior to the Microsoft time. I was with a company called VictorOps, which was kind of in this same space, and spent a lot of years hanging out with folks like Ernest on the DevOps circuit and just learning all things SRE and operations and DevOps, of course. So yeah, I've kind of been in the space for a little while too, and really excited to be here, chat with you.
Excellent. Awesome. Let's start with a lowball question. And I confess this wasn't in the list that we prepped for, but it's an easy one. So what is monitoring? Like just baseline. Who wants to give it to us? Peco, you're laughing. So let's start with you. What is monitoring?
I'm laughing because, there's probably, you get two people in a room and ask them that question. They'll give you 10 different answers.
Yes.
Ultimately, the way I look at it, at monitoring nowadays is like more like what's the end goal, right? We want to ensure that the services and products that we're delivering to the people that will use them, behave well, right? That'll be my very one sentence definition. And just ultimately, it's like what utility are we delivering that that works well, it's reliable, it performs well, doesn't crash, all those things.
Excellent.
And then the monitoring is the practice of ensuring that, whatever it takes.
Cool. Anyone want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I would. So
Yeah.
I think very end of your statement, I think was really good. It's like, I would say that monitoring is a practice. Like it's a thing you do, right? Like, and like you said, there is an outcome that you want to get from it. I like to always compare this kind of stuff to medicine, because people deal with medicine a lot. Like, I'm not a doctor, but like I've seen a couple, right? And most people have like dealt with medical things in any way. But like monitoring is like, it can be the doctor doing like palpitations, just like really simple, or it can be like an X-ray, which can see bones but not soft tissue, or it can be like MRI, which can do like magic, And so like those are all monitoring for the human body, and like the purpose is not to like construct a map of your body just for fun. Like there's a goal in mind, right? Like we're trying to figure out why you're coughing and why like your elbow hurts or whatever. So like it does have to have a purpose, but really it is a practice that can include many potential tools, whether it's a giant MRI machine or just like your fingertips and your brain. So that's the way I look at it. Like it's a very broad term. So it's really easy to like get sucked into like, well, monitoring is our particular product. And you're like, well, is it really? Like, it can be used for monitoring, but it's actually a very broad thing.
Yeah, I like that analogy, right? Because there's a practice of medicine, and then there's individual medicines you take, right? Which are kind of the tool equivalent.
Yeah, words are hard.
Yeah, but yeah, to me, monitoring is kind of about understanding what is going on with your systems and their output, right? So, medicine's a good analogy there too. It's like, is there something wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Yeah, let me now fix it. That's the core challenge, I think, that we all look to monitoring to help with.
Excellent.
I'll add on to that just a tiny bit, because I feel like kind of what Steve was mentioning is it really depends on the application of who's trying to monitor what. And I think monitoring at its core is still just creating this scenario where we can observe something to see what its behaviors are, and if that's to learn what went wrong and fix the code, in a debugging or troubleshooting sort of mentality, that's great. But maybe it's also to, monitor the score of a game and see what, changes need to be made at halftime. There's just, it's monitoring is a big topic. And I think in our space, we tend to be just referring to online systems, large distributed systems and that types of thing. And it's interesting, I think, how the word observability has sort of made its way into our vocabulary as a way to create a second tier of monitoring that maybe applies a little bit more specifically to what we're doing. I don't think observability is a word that you hear in like the ER rooms when you're talking about, X-rays and things like that. But maybe, I don't know. That's just something that stands out to me in our space, that's a term that seems to encapsulate monitoring, but obviously metrics, logs, other terms are part of that too. But monitoring is, you're going to get a different answer, every time you ask somebody different.
Absolutely. And one of the things you guys have both touched on, Steve and Jason, is like, there's a lot of aspects to even what we think of as monitoring, even in our space. And one of the problems that a lot of teams come to us about is that they're suffering from tool sprawl. They have your blood pressure monitor and your heart rate monitor, but then there's also like the other tools in their stable, and dealing with all of that stuff. So for organizations that are kind of struggling with how to apply or deploy or approach all of these different tools that are available, like, do you have recommendations for how they should be looking at or thinking about all the possible solutions that are out there for monitoring? In like, to me, it seems crazy. Like, the last time I looked for a monitoring tool was probably 15 years ago. So like now the explosion has been amazing, the number of tools that are available.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where there's a lot of subtlety. I remember when Peco and I were putting together kind of our monitoring systems at National Instruments, we would go back to our director and say, okay, well, now we want to buy this monitoring tool. And he's like, you already bought a monitoring tool.
Yes.
Right? Why do we need two? And we're like, well, you see. Now, I would say, like, So there's some cases in which I would argue this isn't really a problem, right? So like some folks come at this just out of a pure OCD, right? Like it's like tool sprawl can be a problem, but make sure it's a problem. Team 1 using one tool set and team 2 using another tool set is not necessarily a problem, right? The P0 is each service is supported with excellence, and the people supporting it have good monitoring and understand their tools, right? So like that needs to be the base we start with. But I would definitely say it's the tool landscape has too many tempting things, right? So if you're, kind of just focusing down to you trying to get monitoring squared away for your application, I always recommend taking basically a lean approach, right? Like start with the bare minimum of the major kinds of monitoring, right? Synthetics, metrics, logs, whatnot. And then learn your systems, learn what you need to know, and iterate from there. It's real easy to just buy 5 giant suites, and none of the monitoring vendors can resist adding on all the other junk to their suite, right? And then you have a huge kind of logistical tail behind you. So it's very possible to have too much monitoring. And I would say, like, don't just put it because you can have it. Put it there because you're like, we need this. We need to understand this more. Oh, now we need distributed tracing. Don't add distributed tracing just because somebody said it was cool on Hacker.
He's cool. You should totally do it.
Very cool.
I'll agree with Ernest, and I'll disagree with him a little bit. I think from an engineer standpoint, I think, just use the tools that make sense to you. Use the tools that get the job done, with purpose. If you ask like a CFO or, the management people, like they'll have a different opinion. There's always like, well, can we squeeze budget here and there to, get better, better results? Or so depending on who you ask, that, tools pro may be a problem. I think from a organizational broad perspective, I think the challenge that I see most bigger organizations starting to face is like when they have too much variety, and it's hard to then engineers that need to cross function to actually use these tools effectively. So as long as you're budgeting training and actually getting the people to be able to effectively use the tools and the data that they have, that's not a problem. If you're just buying tools like Aaron said, because it's a new shiny object and we have Kubernetes and now we have to have everything about Kubernetes, even though we have no idea how this is going to play, then it's a problem. So I think, again, just my perspective is focus on people and then people on purpose, and everything else kind of lays itself out. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I like to suggest that people follow like a economics-based approach as well. And one thing that doesn't work in economics is hidden cost or hidden prices or even hidden value. As soon as you start hiding information from different silos, for example, you start to make bad choices, right? Like there's plenty of examples in economics where people make choices that are against their own benefit, right? Like because they're ill-informed. And this can happen in our position as well. So often you'll see where a centralized group will sort of force a tool onto a team because they're the only ones who have control over the budget, and they're not willing to relinquish that. This is bad, right? If you can tell a team like, no, you can't have that tool because it's expensive, because it costs this much, because the value that we're getting from this is not blah, blah, blah. Like that's a step in the right direction. Like ultimate nirvana, of course, is like having every team have its own like complete insight into how much things cost and how much value they're giving and everything. But like, you're never going to actually get there. But like, I just suggest think in terms of an economist, like come up with your own currency inside your company. You can call it, dog bucks or something. And you can just make it up and say like, we're producing this much value, we're costing this much. And it doesn't have to be real dollars if you like you have restrictions around that. Cause like there's plenty of good reasons why you shouldn't actually look at the actual dollar numbers. But being able to have some way of seeing what sort of trade-off you're making is very helpful, because the other option is kind of just like tyranny and that doesn't work very well. But it's very, very common. So it's pretty sad.
Yeah.
I'll add that, of course, I think the constraints of everybody's situation plays a lot to do with it, like Steve mentioned, with budgeting, and but for me, it really comes down to just having effective communication across all the teams that may or may not have this quote unquote sprawl. I think for a lot of engineers, they're probably just like some of us when we walk into a Lowe's or a Home Depot. You wouldn't call that tool sprawl. You might call that, just a toy chest. This is everything I could ever need here, and it's all available to me. And every one of these has 20 different ways that it can solve the problem. I think it's a matter of understanding what tools do we already have in our team, and what experts do we have who know how to use those tools, and really just taking an inventory of what do we have in our tool chest. Who do we have available to us that knows how to use this, that can either do the task or help share with others how to do those tasks. But just taking a consolidation of what you have and then figuring out what you're trying to solve. You're going to get one tool that does this one thing in a very specific way, but there might be 3 others that does it too, does the same thing. And there's probably some constraints, maybe with either cost or licenses or whatever, that also goes into the recipe of, is this going to be the right tool for us? So like so many things, it always depends on the application. But tool sprawl in general, I think, is a term that maybe doesn't scare as many of us as it used to, because I think we just understand that every day there's a new tool, and we're curious. We're going to go figure out if this tool solves a problem that we have in a new, novel, and more efficient way. And if so, we're going to add it to our list and maybe phase out something else that doesn't quite do it all for us.
Awesome. Yeah.
Another thing I'd like to throw in there is also consider the level of abstraction that your tool works at. So I try to advise people who are building things in the cloud, on proper distributed systems that are maybe more modern, focus less on the infrastructure monitoring and focus more on the application layer monitoring. And often people don't like that message. They say but we've been doing infrastructure monitoring for so long, it's worked so well. And I tell them I know, but we have changed as a society. Things are actually physically different. It's not just these new tools came out and I'm trying to shill for them. It's the systems that we're working on now are actively ignorant of infrastructure failures. And that's on purpose, right? This is what distributed systems are. And so knowing what all your infrastructure failures are is just literally less important if you have that type of system. And what's more important is the systematic failures. So if you have emergent failures where all your systems look like they're working fine, but something goofy is happening up here in the, in the sky, that's the thing that you actually need to care about. So not only should you focus on the number of tools you have, but look at where the layers are. And I would suggest investing more in the higher layer of abstraction and less in the lower layer.
And Steve, I would agree with you. And I wanted to actually add a couple of things too. I completely agree with take a stacked approach, and make sure that you're accounting for, not just the easy things that you can get, but the things that you actually need.
Yeah.
So for example, still to this day, just boggles my mind, end user experience monitoring is this kind of thing that marketing people do, business people do, and it should really be part of the common practice that, we all care for, right?
Yep.
And the other thing I was going to mention is you have the stacks, and then being able to really connect the stacks in a meaningful way, right? So context from a user to an application to a system to database, and network in between. So just having a lot of tools that are siloed and disconnected also doesn't, on paper you may say yeah, I check the box, I have all this, but if it doesn't connect well and give you the right workflow, then it's in a lot of situations maybe actually not useful.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I totally agree with focusing on outcome-based monitoring. You want all the other stuff, but that should be stuff you dig into for troubleshooting, right? If the first thing you go look at is a CPU metric, you're totally doing it wrong, right? You should be driven there by a higher level metric, and then you're digging down into the guts of the machine to figure out maybe where the problem is. But so definitely focus on that. And I think good point on the interrelation between the different kinds of monitoring. And there's a lot of different things people have thrown together to do that, right? Of course, monitoring vendors like Datadog, right? They spread across the different kinds of monitoring, so you kind of can have a little bit of a more single pane of glass, right? There's also dedicated products people sell you to be your single pane of glass, or even there's a whole new segment for kind of monitoring data lakes now, right? So that everybody can feed their data into it. That those can be helpful, but a little bit of planning and figuring out how you want them to flow helps. I think it starts with like really defining your scenarios, right? It's like, what do you want it to do? You don't just want data. You want to be told when something's wrong, and then when something's wrong, you need to be able to effectively dig through it and find out what's wrong. And that provides a very useful framework of how to tie those together that isn't just arbitrary, right?
And I think we have to give site reliability engineering as like a whole movement a lot of the credit for some of this change in posture. You know, like it doesn't seem that long ago that we're monitoring CPU and memory and network latency and things. Well, that was really all that was available to us. And now, you know, 10, 20 years later, there's a whole lot more stuff. But thanks to people at the folks at Google, who came up with a lot of the SRE principles and the golden signals and whatnot, we now know that it makes much more sense for us to pay attention to what the customer or the user is actually experiencing and take action off of that, rather than seeing some sort of arbitrary spike at a much lower point in the stack, which may or may not have anything to do with what the user is actually experiencing. So a lot of that, I think, has become just sort of table stakes. Like that's just how we do it around here. We don't alert in the middle of the night because we saw some anomaly, somewhere deep in the stack that just probably didn't affect a user, if anybody's even doing anything at that time. So we've gotten a lot smarter over how we monitor and what we monitor, and really just like what's important at the end of the day, because we can only do so much. And I think, you know, the more we can get machines and code to kind of do some of the lifting for us, the better off.
Yeah.
The joke I like to make with Google stuff, like, so I was SRE for a long time and, you know, lived through this whole evolution. But like the joke we would always make is that Google's always slightly broken. Like even right this minute, like something in Google is just super broken. I guarantee it. But you can't tell. It doesn't matter. So one way to, and again, this goes back to the distributed system nature of it all, right? It's the purpose of it is to be able to have this massive scale and not have to care about the tiny little things that are broken. But like something that's like more useful than stories like that is we have a good acronym that again comes from the medical field, and it's SOAP, SOAP, right? And so it's subjective, objective, action, or analyze and plan, right? So subjective is like, where does it hurt? You know, so when you walk into the doctor's office, the doctor doesn't say like, we're going to give you an x-ray for your elbow before you start talking, right? You're going to come in and say like, you know, my hair's falling out or whatever. Like you have to have like a complaint, and that helps to focus the actual problem at hand. And then objective is like, okay, we're going to do all these measurements. This is where monitoring comes in. Like traditional monitoring was all of these possible causes, right? So we're actually starting with a symptom. Then we're going to look at the possible causes that are relevant. Then the next one is analyze, which is take your understanding of the system as it's built and as it's designed and as you've seen it over the last, 5 years that you've been operating it, and like connect the symptoms, the S and the O together, and be like, I think it might be blah, right? Like do some thinking. And then the next step is not like prevent, it's just plan. Like what's the next step we should do? Like stop the bleeding, set the cast, whatever you need to do right now, and then just loop again and again and again and again. And that model works really well up and down the stack. So like you can, this works well with the monitoring story as well. As like, it's basically SLOs, dashboards, like run books, and then incident response is those 4 same letters approximately.
Awesome. So along with all that, like the transition from more traditional systems administration, web operations, and the like machine-based monitoring and even basic stuff like the garbage collection off your Tomcat processes or whatever we used to do, into this more distributed systems model, microservices environments, and all of those things have led us to, I hopefully, as you've been saying, like illuminate the shortcomings in the tooling that we had at the time, and improve things as the environments have evolved. Along with that, we've now seen this emergence of more observability, and that set of solutions and new vocabulary words and like different ways of thinking about digging into the system there. So for folks who are maybe new to observability, aren't sure if they actually need it, are there starting places that sort of gather up all of these things we've been talking about with like the different tools for different purposes and like the user experience part of it and use that to sort of jump themselves into what they might be getting out of like an observability workflow or something along that line?
I'll jump in here first. I think a lot of it depends on who the team is that you're talking to. They're going to have different goals and aspirations or things that they're trying to avoid, maybe. I feel like most of the teams I've worked with in the past in sort of an SRE capacity, we've always had conversations around what keeps you up at night. Like what's the one thing that could, unfold this whole house of cards. And just having a good grasp on what that is across all of the different, pockets within engineering and really, to be honest, all the way up into the C-level, parts of things where they've got real business logic now that plays a big role in just the day-to-day operations of the company. And they want some dashboards too. And they want to know not really what's going on with the nuts and bolts underneath everything, but from a high level, maybe it's just something like what's today's profit. That all plays a role into what our systems are doing or aren't doing correctly. So I think it really depends on who you're talking to. Kind of like what we were saying with monitoring previously, the observability stuff just takes it to a new level. And if you're a front end engineer, probably the tracing stuff is going to be super interesting to you while you're writing something new and debugging. And something else is going to be more of a sticky tool for people who might be more on the SRE side or more on the operations side. So they just have different things that they're looking for, and what keeps them up at night, I think, is still the most basic way I usually phrase it for somebody is like, there's lots of things we could monitor. Let's just pick the ones that are important. What are you worried about?
Yeah. And, I completely agree with Jason on this. I think I'll go back to that, context again. It's in a different light though. So it's really important, regardless of what data or what tools are being picked, to understand the boundaries of the contract. And then what is the ultimate value that your widget is responsible for? Where I see conflict when, tools or data is being looked at is, and when teams are getting pitted against each other because they don't necessarily understand the boundaries and what's happening at the very end of that value chain delivery, right? So, for example, I have a business transaction failing, which has a chain of microservices, and each microservice by itself may be operating within norms, but just based on a specific payload, 1% of requests are failing. So from their individual standpoint, yeah, I'm happy, like we're within our SLO and budgets, right? But when you chain everything together and you multiply the failure rates, all of a sudden the business transaction is at 70%, not at 99.8% that each individual service is serving. So I think it's again, tracing is really good at, if implemented throughout this entire context, to be able to tell you that, distributed tracing. But again, it's more like, again, to your point about communication between teams and understanding like what's the end goal of what we're doing, and then being able to work together to achieve that goal in context.
I mean, I would argue there's not a tooling difference between monitoring and observability. Like, there's just not. Everybody has rebranded themselves to an observability tool, if nothing else, right? I feel like observability was just kind of like DevOps. It was a reminder to look at, but why are you doing this, right? It's if you force me to define observability, I would say mindful monitoring, right? Just don't just have a bunch of stats because you can have a bunch of stats. The goal is for you to be figuring out what's going on. So I don't know that anybody necessarily needs talking into needing an observability stack. I think everybody kind of intuitively understands that they need that. I think the focus there is just be thinking about why. I mean, none of these tools are really new. In fact, one of the things I think is interesting is things like distributed tracing and correlation and deviation and stuff like that have been around many years. In fact, Peco loved the application performance monitoring tool we bought to do it so much, he went to work for them for, I don't know, a decade or something. So, you know, the none of those things are new. They're, you know, now there's open source versions of a lot of them, but it's really about just thinking through, what is it I need to know? Why do I need to know it? And that has all the knock-on effects of ideally keeping things, you know, lower cost and lower sprawl and more integrated, because you've you know, you're not thinking about it from tools first. You're thinking about it from what is it that I need first.
Someone just asked me the other day, like, why should developers instrument their code? And I was like, well, of course, like, because we need to know. And he's like, wait, just like, why should they care? Like, what do they get out of it? Like, it's just overhead for them. Like, why should they talk about the, you know, number of locks, you know, in this system at any given time? And like, the answer is like, oh shoot, yeah, well, like, I get it. So the motivation for that though is because the operations isn't their problem. So they say like, well, if it's, you know, if you care about locks, go put the lock check in, like, you know, ops guy, go, you do it. So one suggestion that seems to work with some customers is to make sure that the things that the developers do care about generally is at the business logic level. We suggest that you make two dashboards. You make a product dashboard and an operational dashboard, but you make them with the same thing, right? You make them with the same monitoring observability suite that you use. So something that I see very often, which makes it harder, is that people will use a separate system, like, and they'll call it an analytics system for like the product dashboard. And that'll be like over here, and it'll be like in the biz dev side of the house. It'll be like totally like a whole different building, right? Like, I don't know what those people do, but they make these crazy dashboards and they're behind by like 25 minutes, and who cares? Like, we have the operational dashboards. They're like real time, but they don't tell us anything meaningful to the product. I guess a bunch of CPU heat and stuff like that. So like separating these two worlds and not being able to connect like business success to like too many disks failing at the same time, because you fundamentally built them separately from each other and there's no way to connect them. That's clearly bad once you get there. But how do you prevent it? Like, how do you get the folks who are in charge of like, you know, widgets per second to actually add a counter, like, you know, in, you know, open telemetry new thing, that, you know, widget increment? Like, how do you get them to do that? You do that by making it like product specific first, and then you build a tree from that, right? Like, even if it's not fit like on the screen, like, it doesn't have to be a tree, but like, you know, fundamentally, like mentally, they should like, if the widgets per second is bad, that's caused by 7 things, which are caused by 2 things, which are caused by whatever. Like, they can build that tree, and they can do it in the same like way of thinking, in the same context, in the same tool. So it's a good sort of like hack into getting people to kind of care about this stuff. And it gives often we see operators or SREs aren't too familiar with like the application code.
Yeah.
And it gives them a chance to like, hey, I'm going to write the one for widgets per second. Just copy my code and do it for the other stuff later, right? And it's in the right context. It's in the same file, might be in the same class, right? It gives people who aren't super familiar with the code a chance to be like, okay, I'm going to do it that way. That seems to work for this dashboard, so I'm going to make it work for this other dashboard. And they don't have to start from scratch every time. So those are just a couple tips to help people like not make it someone else's problem, but like make it more collaborative between the different teams, because we're all trying to solve the thing together, you know?
And to your point, Steve, like, it can be as simple as like just log a message saying that you processed, you know, 10 widgets and then
Whatever. Yeah.
happened, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be like the, you know, instrumentation and tracing and everything else.
It doesn't always have to be a span. Yeah.
It always seems to come back to incentives. And I feel like, my very, very first DevOps days that I ever went to was the one in Silicon Valley, probably 2014 or 2015. And I went to my very first open space was one on something around being on call. Of course, this was while I was at VictorOps, and sure there were people in there from PagerDuty. And I remember one guy from Chef had posed the question, and the very first response, I wish I could remember who it was who said it, because I'll never forget, was put the developers on call and see how quickly they change their opinions about all this monitoring stuff. Like, why should we instrument anything? And that right there was, I don't know why it just hadn't really like struck me in a way that you almost have to like make them feel the pain before they'll actually, want to be able to have a real conversation about these types of things, like what's important. And, I think we spent like 10 years or more, like really fighting that battle of let's not let people just throw the code over into production and it's somebody else's problem. I feel like we've kind of won that argument. Like, again, that feels like that's table stakes now for most teams. But it's still, there's people, I mean, you can over instrument something to where it starts affecting, the actual service too. And so I think you can start to have some real conversations around how much is too much, have we added on too many things on our dashboard? We got so many gauges and widgets now. I have no idea what it's even telling me. So again, I think that just kind of comes back to the conversation around understanding what's problems that you're really worried about, what tools can tell me that, who do we know in our team that can actually operate these tools well, and stick with that.
Yeah, that was kind of my next question, is like on both sides, on the consumers of alerts and monitoring output, it's overwhelming to have a lot of that stuff there for a lot of folks. But I feel like also on the alert and notification and information generation side, like you say, it can have a negative effect on the overall performance of the system. And I know we used to see that years ago when I was working in web operations. Like, okay, if I'm just monitoring our logs, like I know right off the top, 15% of that is our logging and metrics, and I'm pinging like a stats endpoint and other things there that I need to pull off the stats right at the beginning. And like, it just seems silly. But so for folks that are struggling under this, like, weight of amazing information, like you have so much available to you, it feel like the dog that caught the car. Like there's just so much there. How do you even consume it? And how do folks go about saying, well, and like, we hate turning stuff off. Personally, I love to turn a thing off. But like, I walk into any place and they're like, oh, well, we've got this old thing. It's been here since the 70s and it's great and we love it. And you're like, you should probably turn that off because, oh my God. But getting a handle on what's important, what might be important. You feel like data hoarders, right? When you get all these things here, you don't want to let it go just in case it might be useful later. Like how do you coach people through that sort of anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, it's not cheap, right? So I remember when Peco and I were working together, we had a system that was over monitored. We did an analysis and I was like, okay, 30% of all of our system load is coming from all of the different, kinds of monitoring, right? 30% of our CPU and storage were burning and like all of this. And it's too much, right? It's really easy nowadays to just say, well, sure, I'll add some more. And sometimes the cost is apparent, like not to throw Datadog under the bus because this is actually helpful, right? But I've had people, it's like, oh, well, I need some more ordinality on that custom metric. Let me add another, and then we're like, our Datadog bill went up by 30%. What the hell are you doing, right? The thing is, you're doing that to yourself, whether you're consuming it through a SaaS that's actually showing you what you're spending or not. Right. So it's very easy to just say, well, I just want all this data and it's all going to somehow be useful. But, you have to have the discipline and set up kind of the process of, and it applies to application functionality. It applies to infrastructure. What's the value of the thing we've added? Does it have enough value? Does it need to be ramped down or entirely removed, right? Good product organizations remove features that are not pulling their weight, right? It's the same thing with monitoring. I know a lot of people that have put in distributed tracing and it's just too much for them and they're not really getting use out of it. And it's like, you have to have the courage to say, not useful, I'm going to tear it out, right? There's a lot of incentives against that from a status and whatever, like people never want to admit that they, people couch it as a mistake when instead they couch it as, we experimented to learn more about our system. We determined this is not the way to do it. We have learned. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I have really strong opinions on this one
Okay.
based on my prior experience. I think it's one of those things where you always have too much, yet you never have enough. Like I often see like this trope now is like 99% of data is total crap. Like don't do it. But you don't know which 1% you need, right? And I think back to Ernest's point about incentives, I think some of this is some of the impetus of collecting a lot that you may not even need is in that spur of a moment where I'm trying to solve a problem, right? And when I'm troubleshooting or diagnosing something and I really need to get an answer quickly, it skews toward this like massive data collection. So I have all the traces, I have all the metrics, I have everything in very fine resolution down to 1 second in some cases. So the last 5 minutes are more important than anything else. And in some scenarios, that's true. Like you have financial organizations that are literally they'll be losing billions if they're down for an hour. So they need to very quickly spot things. In other cases, it's the thing that other people have done. Now we're going to copy it for our environment just because. So I think back to Ernest's point, just like what makes sense, and really like start with the question of like, if I had this data, what would I do with it? If I had this, set of diagnostics, or what would I actually do with it if I had an incident or if I had a problem?
I think this. Sorry, Peco. I was just going to say, I think that this really highlights the value of your post-incident activities. I feel like in post-incident reviews, this is a great opportunity to review what data did we not have available to us when we needed it. What did we have, and that was super helpful. Because we can monitor just about everything, and disk space is getting cheaper by the day. So what ends up happening is people just collect everything and then do some pruning labor, and we can have conversations around sampling and retention rates and aggregation of data and lots of different tricks that you can do to like thin up your data, cold storage all kinds of tricks. But I think at the end of the day, when you're the person who is responding to an incident and you don't have the data that you need or that you think might help you uncover what's going on, that needs to come up in a pretty, structured conversation later about what we learned and what we can actually do to improve. And maybe we need to add something that we missed. But maybe we also realize that we are sending way too much into this one channel, and it's just a flood of stuff, and we can't even search there. We can't parse this, so you'll just end up finding out all kinds of stuff about how good your data is or isn't. And I think that's it's like the garden. You just have to keep pruning your data and keep pruning your systems until they do exactly what you expect them to.
Yeah, I'd go back to the symptoms versus causes thing that is in like all the SRE books. Like start with the top, like describe the symptoms that matter to you. Like, is it available? Is it fast? Is it correct? Is the throughput sufficient? Like things like this that matter to the end users. Tie those to critical user journeys. Like, can I check out fast correctly? Can I search the thing correctly? Can I do all the things appropriately? And then if you can construct a causality tree from those are the kind of like the, you sort of like highlight those metrics with like a green one. You're like, these are all like, we should probably keep all these, right? And there's just going to be myriad other metrics that are out there that might be useful one day, maybe, and you don't really know. And like, you should at least be aware that that's a thing. Like, you don't really need everything all the time. And so you should allow yourself to like mark some metrics as like keep, and mark some as like, and mark some as like, definitely don't eat them. Like, just trash them, right? And then you can do these tricks that Jason is talking about where you're like, keep the green ones in memory, put the other ones on disk, and put the other ones like in Glacier or just toss them, right? And at least starting to go down that path helps a lot. And it's important to kind of like revisit this occasionally. And the way to revisit it is through incidents, right? So like when stuff does break, this is how we learn like, oh, that thing that we thought was yellow, it's actually green, because like there's this complex, this emergent behavior where we had this causality tree and we didn't realize that these two things, if they're both bad at the same time, cause this third thing to go off. And like that wasn't in our tree before, but like now that I think about it, it totally is, right? So what do you do from there? You don't get mad and be like, how dare you not know that previously, you bad developer. You just learn from it, right? You move on, right? And you're like, well, we should definitely mark that one as green as a keeper, right? Put it on the dashboard. Don't make an alert out of it necessarily. If it's an underlying, has to be 5 things all at once, but like make it observable, make it discoverable. Try to connect it to whatever it is actually logically connected to.
Yeah, one and a technique I've had a lot of luck with. Remember that like our systems are a lot more dynamic now, right? As we start to apply AI ops and stuff like that, like you don't always have to keep all those metrics all the time, right? You have to be careful about this. If you turn up the level of monitoring on your system, you need to make sure it's not going to make a problem worse. But right, it's just like your medicine analogy. You don't get a X-ray of your elbow every day just in case.
Right.
You do it when things go bad, right? So like when I was at Alien Vault, we had kind of our end-to-end test suite, right? And we're like, okay, we run it. And then we're like, should we run this in production? Boy, that would be real good. And so we had a thing where it's like, okay, when something seems like it's starting to go wrong and we start getting all the metrics and stuff, it's like, turn that on. It's the Star Trek equivalent of, Mr. Scott, go run me a level 3 diagnostic, right? And suddenly you get a bunch more signal, right? And now you can even trigger that, right? For the first time you get an alert, crank the level up, the logging levels, turn on metrics that you're not keeping 24/7 by 365, right? If you need them for 15 minutes, give them for 15 minutes.
Yeah, another important thing to go with this is like the concept of gradual change and the idea of like utilizing your failure domains. So if you're not doing gradual change across failure domains, then you're like, hey, boss, we're going to wait for things to break before we learn from them. Like, you're going to do what? Right? But like, if you know that you can make a change to a small part of the system, and if it breaks a little bit, it's actually not a big deal. Like if you're actually building a distributed system that fails, at least if not in a predictable, like for a predictable reason, if it at least fails in a predictable shape, like, it's the failure is not going to go past these 2 walls, right? If you can do that, then you have a much better chance of like convincing people this is a good idea, right? And that's really the only way to do this at scale, and not be like throwing bodies into the fire of just like, forget more ops, we need more eyeballs on dashboards, right? Like that's no good, right? You don't want to the joke we use is we don't want to feed the machine human blood. Like that's no good, right? You want to make sure that you can actually control the spread of the failure, and you can detect it ahead of time. You can detect it when it happens, but it's not too late, right?
Yeah. In the spirit of not, yeah, in the spirit of not feeding the machine humans. Like that's a little grim, but you're totally on the right track there. And Ernest mentioned it too, is that, starting to incorporate AI ops. And for folks, I had to write it down, for folks who aren't familiar with sort of the going definition of AI ops, I'll give it to you here. This is from Gartner, right? So the AI ops practices are using big data and machine learning to automate IT operations processes, including event correlation, right? The kind of things we're talking about, anomaly detection, and causality determination. So it's super focused on the signal coming out of your systems and what you can do with it there. So like, this is sort of an emerging set of patterns that are being incorporated into products. We have some of this solution that's coming out into the PagerDuty platform, and I'm sure Datadog does as well. Like working with that stuff, like what's that look like for practitioners? What are you seeing as folks working in this space for what you hope to see out of AI ops, or what you see folks already benefiting from for in the spirit of, not feeding more humans into the machine and letting the machines take care of some of this for themselves, really?
I can jump in here first, since you mentioned Datadog, and in the world of AI ops, or I guess we should just back up, because I think in the world of AI in general, a lot of stuff gets thrown in there, when in reality, maybe what we're talking about is not truly AI or machine learning. It's something else. We'll call it intelligent tooling. And I think there's a lot of stuff that falls into that category. There's even some things at Datadog, one thing called Watchdog, that's super popular with doing this type of stuff, looking for things in between the lines that are just harder to find, that a machine can find, quite honestly, just a lot easier for us. And we're going to see more and more of that, since OpenAI kind of revealed what the future looks like with things like ChatGPT and the availability of large language models to all of us. We're going to see more and more stuff that is either generated by AI, monitored by AI, deployed by AI. I mean, you can put ops at the end of just about everything these days and create a whole industry. And we've got AI ops now. And I think sometimes it is a machine learning tool that is going out there and making life easier for the practitioner. I think at the end of the day, that's when I sit down and I start creating some sort of demo or play around with OpenAI or Bard or any of them, I'm trying to just create a solution to a problem I personally have. And I think that's what people are trying to do with all of these things. And so if we can find a tool that makes it easier for those people who are on call so that they aren't the first responder, maybe there's something else that actually has a way of, doing that pattern matching that we like to say we do so well. Machines can do it a little bit better. And so let's let them sort of take that first wave of stuff off our plate. I'm all for that, but I think we also have to, call a spade and be careful about what we call AI and what we just, is just sort of the evolution of tools. Really, it doesn't necessarily call out to some sort of artificial intelligence.
I think that's a really good point. Like there's a lot of stuff being branded as AI ops that, like, it's not that it's not useful, but it's kind of like, when you walk down a hallway in an office building and the lights come on when you get near and then they turn off when you go away. That's not AI, yo. Like I'm sorry.
It was AI at some point, but
yeah. Like that is not the ghost in the machine. I think where the AI parts are actually the most helpful, right? So a lot of these techniques have been around. So like correlation and deviation, Peco should wax poetic about that in the tool he used to work on. Like, we've been startlingly unsophisticated in IT monitoring over the years, right? Just even when we were working with some kind of electrical engineers at National Instruments, putting together a web service to do FPGA compilation, and like they're sitting there, it's like, okay, well, here, put on some low pass signal filters, and we'll do all this, and we're just like, in IT, we average it, and then we heard averages are bad, and we do 90th percentile, like, and he was like, what are you, 10? What the hell, right? And that's been the state of the art, right? And those things, they just haven't been consumable, right? We've been all like, oh, Holt-Winter's dynamic baselining, oh, automatic correlation. And tools that do that have trouble getting traction because it's been hard for people to actually use. That is where I think the AI parts are going to be helpful. So like the actual AI tool I like to point to where I'm like, I think that's doing it right is Kubernetes GPT. It's like K8s GPT, which basically explains your Kubernetes cluster to you in English, right? Because like there's a bunch of weird stuff going on. It's like, hey, looks like your controller is down, right? Like that's taking that information and making it actually consumable for an end user. That's, I think, the vast majority of, especially the near-term benefit we're going to get out of AI.
Yeah, and I agree with Ernest, and I think another effect that I anticipate is overall, just because of the amount of computation that we can do now, not necessarily just focusing on the last 5 minutes, like being able to actually understand system dynamics, on a little bit of a longer range, right? And in a human digestible way, versus like I have one engineer that that spends like 10% of his time every once in a while, and he's like the super expert and he can figure everything out. Everybody else is clueless. That's a very very common thing.
Yeah, and like you're saying, like sometimes in monitor, all I want is the first or second derivative. Like depending on what I'm looking for, I want to be able to do a little bit of calculus on this thing. I want the rate of change. I want the rate of change. And even getting that far, okay, not everybody studied math, but like those things are super helpful, and we don't get them out of a lot of tooling. And like trying to get into something that's a little bit more fancy wizard in the sky feels like an over rotating in the direction of folks don't know what they want, don't know what they're looking for, and don't know enough of the math to be able to say, I want the first derivative of this series to find the rate over time or whatever. It seems like a real shortcoming on our side as an industry that we don't have enough of that, maybe enough of that knowledge across the board.
I think that some of the tools that I'm seeing out there today, currently they're available. What I'm mostly taking from them as a positive is that they're doing a pretty good job of abstracting away some of the complexities of this stuff in technology, which I think at the end of the day makes it so that, I don't know if democratizing is the right word, but it makes it much more available to more people. More people could now be on call and do certain things because you have an AI assistant. You actually have something that didn't exist, just a couple of years ago. If you were the person on call, you relied on other people to help you with some of the stuff. And I think, like Bits AI is a good example with Datadog. The biggest, coolest thing I think that does is you can speak to it in perfect English and it will query the Datadog query language. So I don't have to, I've just started working at Datadog and I've yet to really wrap my head around the DD, query language, because I don't need to. I can just talk to Bits in pure English and get the exact same result. I like that in a way that it makes it easier for me to go get the information. Otherwise, I had hit a block because I couldn't figure out the syntax of a query. I just know what I needed I know the information I wanted. I didn't know how to ask for it. And so now we've got tools that I think can bridge that gap, which is really going to be the win for a lot of them.
Awesome.
Yeah. I would just point out this is a weird time. Like we're very much in a middle ground right now. Like there's a lot of like high pie in the sky like ideas of like it's gonna be able to X, and like be a little skeptical about a lot of those. But then there are some things where like it sounds too good to be true, but actually it does kind of work. And there's no way to tell the difference between those two things right now. Like there's so many like there's so much like discourse around like what it's gonna be like, man, and it doesn't really match up with reality so much. But at the same time, there's some cool stuff. So like gotta be careful. So the things that I would point out are just like LLMs are good at like speaking language and like reading language. And like so if you have anything that you want to like read a lot of language or contribute a lot of language or like translate between languages, so like programming languages and human language or just across different programs, that works actually pretty darn well. So like go for those first. Like those are like known. And then like the anomaly stuff, that's, it's just statistics. Like we've actually been able to do that for a while, but like hooking it into a language model is nice because it's easier you don't have to do all the math as much. You don't have to speak math words. You can speak human words. So like I would focus on that stuff for now.
And the only thing I would add to that is just experiment. That's, I think, some of the coolness of at least through my own experiences, like just some stuff is emergent. You had no idea, like you chain these like 2 or 3 questions together and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is interesting. I didn't know like we would arrive at this conclusion, So I think it's exciting to me because it's, again, like Steve said, we don't know what we don't know, but the only way we're going to figure it out is through practice and experimentation. So, and then all the tooling vendors like us, like Datadog, we're in this world together to figure it out. So it's exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. We're just about at the end of our time. So if folks want to hear more from you, where can they find you on social media? We'll just go around the room. Steve, where are you living now?
I'm Steve McGhee on all the things. There's a secret H in my last name, so you have to look for it. But it's Steve McGhee on all the stuff. So,
awesome. Peco?
Yeah.
Mostly frequenting LinkedIn nowadays. So, Peco Karayanev and LinkedIn. We've done some courses with Ernest there, so you can find some of the stronger opinions there too. But yeah, I'm pretty available there.
Awesome. Ernest?
Yeah, same thing. In the chaos of social media upheaval, it's pretty much down to LinkedIn. Yeah, as Peco mentioned, we've done a number of LinkedIn learning courses, including one on monitoring and observability and one on SRE and stuff like that. That I would love for you to go look at some videos and give us feedback on.
Awesome. Jason?
I too have abandoned ship when it comes to some of the social media. Certainly X. I still have an account, but I haven't been over there in months. You won't find me there. LinkedIn is definitely the place we're all hanging out these days, I feel like. So yeah, come meet me over there, and yeah, we'll continue this chat.
Awesome. And like I've collected up, you guys gave me a bunch of really great resources for folks to follow up on. There's a lot of stuff. I've posted them on a page in our community forums. So, and as we find more stuff, and thanks to shout out to Eric McCraw for putting a link in the chat on LinkedIn there too. I'll add that to the list. A bunch of interesting resources, things to read, State of DevOps report. There's also a really nice article Dora.dev in the capabilities section about observability and monitoring. And there's a link to Peco and Ernest's LinkedIn learning course on there. So you want to check that out. I got through like the first 3 chapters just to see, what was going on there. It's very nicely done. Very professional, very professional. So that's great. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys all for joining us today. This has been excellent. And yeah, if folks have other questions or anything else they'd like to know, you can post them on the event in LinkedIn would probably be the easiest way to do that. Or you can email my team, workcommunity-team@pagerduty.com, and we're always happy to chat and answer questions for you there. And yeah, with that, guys, thank you so much for coming and having this amazing discussion with us today. This has been great. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mandi.
Great. We'll wish everyone else out there an uneventful day.